Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cat B and Andy B Inspired Connection podcast. We are coming to you transatlantic from the UK and the US. In this podcast, we are going to explore and discuss how inspired connections have impacted people's lives positively and demonstrate how you can experience those inspired connections in your life as well. Without further ado, let me welcome my beautiful co host, Cat B, and our honored guest today, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. How are you all doing today?
Yeah, good, thanks. Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?
Wonderful. It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. So for people that, some people in the community will know who you are, but if they don't, we're going to tell your story today because you've got an incredible story. But I wanted to share, first of all, how we met because it was quite synchronistic in some way. So Jeff and I met at the Helping Parents Heal conference. I had, in fairness, known about Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll through his dear friend, Jeff Olson, who Jeff has an incredible connection with. But we hadn't met. We hadn't been formally introduced. I'd only heard of you in passing. I don't think you'd ever heard of me or knew about me. But you'd lost your bag. We were in the main corridor, and anybody who hasn't been to the Helping Parents Heal conference, it is a massive hotel, isn't it? It houses about 1,000 people. And there must have been about 500 people in this corridor when we met. And I was talking to a group of about 12 mums. And I could hear this rustling behind me, and I could feel like somebody was getting panicked over losing something or kind of lost a bag. And I turned around, and there you were, trying to asking if anybody had seen a bag. So we all kind of tried to help you out, find this bag, and it kind of became a little bit of a joke through the conference in terms of us both losing bags. So we got chatting, and you were kind of teasing me that you didn't know who I was and that you didn't know that I was a presenter at the conference, which I think you were very genuine about, Jeff. I think that was the truth. And we ended up chatting, and I remember sort of suddenly having this kind of matrix moment, Jeff, where I turned around and the whole corridor had emptied. Like the 500 people that were there 2 seconds ago, completely. We were left on our own in this corridor, and I was like, God, is it just me, or has everybody disappeared? And we ended up deep in conversation, and I remember thinking, God, I've got to get to bed because I keep having late nights at this conference and I'm working in the morning. And suddenly I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I remember feeling the sense of 2 boys wanting us to go into the main bar area. And I intuitively felt that these 2 boys, their parents were waiting for us, that one of them was waiting to meet you and one of them was waiting to meet me. And I remember saying to you, we've got to go to the bar, we've got to go to the bar. And you were like, no, we can't go to the bar, we'll get mobbed. I was like, no, we've got to go to the bar because these 2 kids are telling us that their parents are waiting for the 2 of us and they're expecting us. And if Kathleen McManus is listening, she's probably laughing as we speak, because Kathy had literally, and this is the truth, Andy, she had put her hands up in the air. She's got 2 sons, Aidan and Connor, in spirit, and she'd said to them, please send me Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. And Kathy Westdyke, who was sat next to her, said, well, if you're having Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, I want Cat B because I haven't seen her yet. There we are. We walk in arm, Andy, together and the scream that went up, it was madness, wasn't it, Jeff? It was madness. Off of this table full of women. It was so funny, Andy. And I went to go to get the drinks at the bar, and he was telling me, you better come back. And I was like, no, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to leave you there all alone. Well, Michelle Claire's dad was teasing us, my table's the best table, Kat. You better come and sit at my table. And so we were having quite a laugh, weren't we? We were having quite a laugh. But it got a little bit weird, Andy, a few days later when I was supposed to go to bed early that night, and I ended up in the bar till about 2-3 in the morning, and I blame Jeff and Farrah Gibson for that. I got to bed, and the next day I was teasing Jeff that he wasn't allowed to come near me. He was on a podcast, and I was like, oh, you can't speak to me because you're on recording, and I would ran into the kind of the canteen area. At which point I bumped into Michelle Claire, and every time Jeff came near, I hid under I don't know if you know this, Jeff, under the table, and he could hear me laughing. He couldn't find me. And so we had quite a giggle. But Michelle, Andy, said to me, "Why are you carrying your bag on your lap?" And I said, "Well, in London, I got my bag stolen, and I've got this paranoia about bags as a result of it." And she went, "Oh my God, Kat, you're at the Helping Parents Heal conference. Nobody's going to take your bag." And she put my bag on the back of the chair, and she said, "This is how we do it in America." And she said, "I'll watch your bag. Don't you worry." And we were laughing. So the next morning, I have to say goodbye to Mark Island, and I promised him that I would go to his presentation in the morning and say goodbye to him and Tina Powers. And sure enough, I did as Michelle had instructed. I put the bag on the back of the chair and I said goodbye to them. And Jeff was nowhere to be seen at this point, Andy. But of course, I'm not being used to putting my bag on the back of the chair. I leave the room. I'm halfway down the corridor when I'm like, oh my gosh, back, and I come running back down the corridor. At which point I bumped straight into Jeff and I'm like laughing and he's like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "I've lost my bag." And he was like, "You can't have." The story continues. There's a big story there, but I don't want to waste time. But we were kind of thrown together, weren't we, Jeff? And when he met, he kept talking about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Conan Doyle. And I trained at the Conan Doyle Centre. So Spirit were really trying to use our sense of humour to build a rapport between us instantly. And I think it's fair to say, Jeff, it worked, didn't it?
It did. I don't remember a lot of the details of that night. What I remember was you were just insistent that we had to get to the bar.
That was me. Not for a drink, I might add, not for a drink. But one of the things that was really poignant about that conversation, Jeff, and one of the reasons that we did get so headlocked together was you'd actually done an amazing presentation there. And one of the conversations or topics of conversation was actually that you'd experienced a little bit of discomfort in the fact that people were reacting to the fact that you have a sibling in spirit and not a child. And at this point, you have two lovely daughters and both of them were living at this point. And so we were having the conversation about how grief isn't about exclusivity. And we were kind of exploring that topic, how different people have different sensitivities and react to it. And of course, since then, very sadly, in fact, only a few months later, Rachel, one of your daughters, was diagnosed with cancer and it was later found to be terminal. So you now have a child in spirit. And so share with us a little bit about your journey and how your perception has changed and kind of how you reacted and have reacted to people that find grief sort of challenging in that way.
Yeah, you might remember that we connected so deeply at the conference in such a short period of time. You invited me to co-host a conference that you were organizing for 6 months hence.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
you kept pressing me to commit to co-hosting this conference. And I kept having these feelings like I shouldn't commit to it for some reason. And that if I did commit to it, I would end up letting you down because something would happen. And so, to your chagrin, I think, and to my disappointment in some regards as well, I chose not to commit to that conference that you were organizing for June, 6 months in advance. And of course, I couldn't have known then, but a couple months later, my father's health took a turn for the worse. And I moved in with him and I provided hospice care for him for 6 weeks until he passed away in May. And then a week after his funeral, my 32-year-old daughter was diagnosed with cancer. And so I would have certainly had to have canceled my attendance at your conference in June because I was helping my daughter and my family and trying to arrange her medical care and all kinds of things. And I remember thinking back and thinking, oh, yeah, Spirit knew in advance that I shouldn't make that commitment. So my daughter You asked about my daughter. She, as I said, was 32 years old. She was a neonatal ICU nurse for 8 years. And then she landed her dream job, the thing that she'd been working for her whole career, to be a neonatal flight nurse. And it was right at the time she completed all of her orientation, became a full-fledged flight nurse, that she was diagnosed with cancer, and she never flew again. She only lived for 6 months, passed away last November. And I don't know whether you knew this, Kat, but over the previous few years, I'd been writing a book, and I had the main character in the book was an emergency physician like myself, struggling to get his head around the experiences he had in the ER that science couldn't explain. And the thing that sent him on his journey of discovery of all things spirit was the sudden death of his adult daughter. And
Oh,
the
wow.
book was all written and edited and ready to go. It was
You,
all written and edited and ready to go to print before my daughter got sick.
oh my gosh, Jeff.
And I remember a couple of years ago, I was writing this one part of the book, and the main character is named Solace Murphy. It's an Irish name. And he's talking to his wife. Their daughter, Zen, had been gone for a few years. And he's just heartbroken. He turns to his wife and he said, "God, I love that kid." And I remember I broke down and cried when I wrote that line in the book. And I wondered, why is this so personal? Why is this such a visceral feeling? And a few weeks after my daughter's diagnosis, I remembered the book sitting on my computer. And I
Oh my
remembered writing that line, and my jaw just dropped open.
Yeah.
My soul must have known.
In my case with Josh, we both, his mom and I and his brother, stepmom as well, all knew to some level that something was going to happen. So I don't know. I'm a believer in that at some level, if we're sensitive to it, we know.
And
Yeah.
Andy's son passed very suddenly in a car accident, Jeff. So had no sort of physical pre-warning in terms of illness, but had a lot of intuition prior to
Yeah.
him passing that something strange was going to occur and arise. So it's so fascinating. It's like saying when I lost a baby, I well, my grandfather in spirit came through to say that the baby wasn't coming, and I warned my husband, and my husband said, "Don't be so ridiculous. The baby's definitely coming. We've got the scans." I was like, "It's not. It's not." And I intuitively knew that it wasn't going to be joining us. And so it's very interesting, isn't it, when we all have these moments? But that's kind of profound that you'd already written the book, Jeff. Was the actual main character based on your own experience with Jess Olsen? Because some people might not know your backstory. Do you want to share a little bit for everybody that's new to
Yes, I'll give you the quick thumbnail version. Just a month before my 12th birthday, my older brother was killed in a farm accident. And it was a few years after that, maybe sooner, I don't remember for sure. But I know by the time I was about 16, I was getting messages and visits from my brother. And I had these kind of spiritual experiences for many years before I went to medical school and became an emergency physician. And sometimes in the emergency department, I would see people's souls leave their bodies when they passed, and they would talk to me before they left. And on one occasion, the one you're referring to with Jeff Olsen, he was involved in a horrible car crash a couple 100 miles away from where I work. And his wife died immediately at the scene, as did his 14-month-old son. And he and his 7-year-old son survived. But Jeff had horrible injuries, more than they could manage at the local hospital. And they flew him 200 miles to the hospital where I work because it was a major trauma center. And when I went into the trauma room to see him, he was unconscious on the gurney. And there were a bunch of people already providing his care. And standing above the gurney was the soul or the spirit of his wife, who had just died at the scene of the accident. And her physical remains were still 200 miles away. But She was there communicating to me how profoundly grateful she was for um, the care that her husband was receiving. About a month later, I met Jeff in his hospital room. He'd been unconscious, so we didn't meet until a month later when he was awake. He'd had a bunch of surgeries, including the amputation of his leg, and I shared my experience with him, and he told me about leaving his body while his physical body was still trapped in the car and meeting his wife in the air above the scene of the accident. And she said, "You have to go back and raise our other son," because one of them had survived and one of them passed. And Jeff and I are still dear friends today. We still see each other often.
It's amazing. So it's such a strong connection, isn't it? You're almost like brothers in some ways. Every time I've ever seen you on stage together, the rapport and chemistry between you. And that's kind of what I want to get across with these inspired connections, Jeff, is that it is so interesting, isn't it, that we only met in a corridor very, very briefly. And yet the connection that Spirit made with us made us feel so comfortable as if we'd known each other for years. And so and the same with Jeff Olson. It's like you have this amazing bond with this gentleman. I mean, nobody can really underestimate it. It's a very, very strong, powerful friendship. And so we're really wanting to sort of express how Spirit connect the living, it's not just about us having this connection with them across the veil. It's the whole community, isn't it? It's powerful.
Yes, it's a big community. And one of the things I love about Helping Parents Heal, and the reason I was speaking at Helping Parents Heal 2 years ago when you were there, when we met, was because Jeff Olson and I speak together so often. And he was there as an invited guest because his son had passed and he was a bereaved father. And he asked me to come and speak with him. And I had experienced death through other family members, but I hadn't had a child pass at that point, as you pointed out. But now, 2 years later, I spoke at Helping Parents Heal in September, and I spoke about my daughter Rachel, and I spoke about the things she taught me in the last 6 months of her life and after she passed, because she's come to me a few times since she passed. And one of the things that is so special about Helping Parents Heal is you can walk into a room of 1,000 people and you don't have to say a word. Everybody already knows what you're feeling. They feel it too. There's a perfect empathy there that just is so healing in the room.
It's so true. That's so true. Poignant. Andy's the same one that all three of us were at the same conference. And it not just that, it was as if you knew everybody. It's really interesting, isn't it? It's like the energy was so powerful with so many light workers in the same area. And just friendships and bonds between people were almost instant. I know there's a lady that I read for sometimes, and she made a best friend at the conference, and they literally walked straight across the opposite ends of the room to introduce each other, complete strangers at the first conference. And they became best friends, and one of them came for a reading, and I brought through the lady's son in spirit, and then she sent her friend for a reading, and he brought through the daughter, and they said they'd actually introduced their parents at that conference, that they'd actually walked across, guided by spirit, to one another. And I found it extraordinary. And I had no idea that the two people were even connected, Jeff. No idea whatsoever. And, they came to me several months apart as well, 6 months apart. And they're now dear friends within the community, and they're still really close friends today. But again, one of those initiations where loved ones felt that they were very compatible, that they had a lot in common, and they threw them together. But they literally said they were like magnets. They just literally found each other in the room, and they couldn't do anything but say hello, which is kind of incredible, isn't it, really?
Yeah, for any of our watchers, I was just going to give a shameless plug to the Helping Parents Heal conference. It's every 2 years. If you're in the bereaved community, please look on their website. Like you've heard, it is an amazing thing. I went to it a few years after my son transitioned, and it was the first time I felt happy up to that point. because the energy was incredible. Like I said, I can't suggest it enough. Particularly if you're in the community, it's a very healing event. Sorry, Dr. Jeff, go ahead.
No, I second what you just said. It's very healing. It is very welcoming. I had notes that I was going to speak about at my daughter's celebration for life. And she came to me the night before and said, "No, Dad, speak about gratitude and miracles." And that was the title of my talk at Helping Parents Heal a couple months ago, was Gratitude and Miracles, Things I Learned from My Daughter. There's always something to be grateful for, even in the worst and most horrible grief. She was in our family for 32 years. What a profound miracle. There's always something to be grateful for, and it helps us navigate the path of grief if we can find something to be grateful for.
Yeah, and that's so well said, because people early in their walk, they feel like there's nothing to be grateful for, but there is, right? And that is an effort, but it is a huge healing point, a technique, if you will, to work yourself through what, the nightmare that you may find yourself in.
Our path of gratitude started almost immediately, because I'd been in the hospital all night with my daughter, and we got her admitted to hospital, and I came home, I took a shower, changed to go back, and my wife stopped me and she said, "How much time do we have?" Because Rachel had very advanced cancer at the time of diagnosis. And I said, "I don't know, maybe a year to 5 years, depending on a response to therapy." And my wife just threw her arms around me and she cried and she said, "Really? We have that long?" Because she was thinking that Rachel might be gone in days or weeks.
Yeah.
And so we were just so profoundly grateful that we had some time, because so many people get nothing but a phone call in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
We were living intensely in the present. It was like every day we didn't know when she'd passed, but we knew she was here today. Let's love each other today and make a memory.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
That's really amazing. How different was it, Jeff, speaking from the second conference to the third? I mean, how much had your mindset changed in that? Could you relate to those comments that the people had made about how different it is when you lose a child, or did you actually not feel exactly the same?
No, grief is very different. In fact, I asked Jeff Olson this question because his son and his wife passed in the same crash at the same moment. And he said, "No, it's very different. I felt very different grief for the passing of my son and the passing of my wife." So I'm not suggesting that it's not different. What I'm suggesting is that we shouldn't judge one another's grief and assume that it's less or more or easier or harder based on their circumstance. Because one of the things I learned through the years when I was having these experiences is that experiences consist of two things: circumstances and feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And people's circumstances can be extremely different, but lead them to the exact same feelings. And the feelings are what change us and craft our soul and make us a different person. The feelings are what give us empathy for another soul. And so that's why it's so important that we don't judge another person's circumstances, because we don't know what they're feeling.
Right.
So
that is so well said.
That's so true. Can I add to that something, Andy? Just in terms of sometimes as well,
Sure.
There's a presumption that if a mother loses a child in pregnancy, that it's not the same, that they can't, they shouldn't be grieving or whatever for that loss, that it was just natural, that the baby wasn't ready to come, or maybe there was something wrong, And I found that that's not the case either. I know from my own experience, even though I was pre-warned, I look at my situation and I think, well, in terms of soul planning, had that not happened to me, I perhaps wouldn't be sat here in front of you guys, but I probably wouldn't have had the empathy to work with the community that I currently do and understand what they're going through and be able to empathize with them to the level that I can help them. So to me, there's certain things that I'm grateful for having lost a child in pregnancy, is that it's given me a level of empathy. However, there are some people that have always wanted a child and that have tried and tried and tried and had several miscarriages perhaps, or maybe they've had the first and it's upset them so much that they've lost heart, or kind of maybe they've struggled with fertility. And I think it's really important for people to realize that those people deserve the opportunity to grieve as well, that it is the loss of a vision of what their future might be like. It's a loss of that excitement. It's a loss of the physical child as well. And so whether you have them, 3 months in the womb, or there's a difference in terms of how you feel when you've brought up a child, but that vision of the future, you still have to grieve that it's changed or evolved in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, and I think this is a great topic. I mean, this could be a whole episode just by itself, but I mean, even step parents, there is like, oh, maybe you're not feeling as deeply as the natural parent or whatever. And I think that's really unfair because everybody is grieving a different relationship, right? Like the way I grieved my son is different than the way his mom grieves him, or his stepmom, or his brothers. It's all different. And I think people, like you said, what this event has taught me in my life is empathy is the most important thing. I'm not feeling Jeff's grief or Kat's grief. I'm feeling my grief, but my grief is opening my heart to their grief and, anybody you meet. So, I mean, like I said, this could be a topic all by itself. This is a great thing.
Yeah, it's just really important, I think, for people to understand that we can come together regardless of what our situations are or what our experiences are, and understand one another, or come to a level of compassion. And I know we've had this discussion before, Andy, where you said that really, like, this experience to you really opened up your heart and you felt flooded with compassion. It was quite the opposite extreme to what you were anticipating. Jeff, advice for people going through something really challenging, like the loss of a child or the loss of a parent. What would you sort of give them in terms of words of wisdom or advice from your experience? Because you've really seen so much diversity in your own experience.
One of the things I would say first off is whatever you're feeling is valid. It's okay to feel it. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to think about your loved one and laugh, even when you're in grief. Some people feel guilty if they laugh, or if they try to have happiness in their life again. And I know from personal experiences and from things that have happened to me that our loved ones want us to be happy. My brother came to me 40 years after he passed, and he gave me a profound spiritual experience. He showed me his life. He showed me my life in review and how he'd intervened on my behalf on certain days in my life. And he showed me the day he died, but he showed it to me from the perspective of my parents. And I experienced their grief and their suffering and anger and sorrow and loneliness. And I experienced it all firsthand as if it were mine. And after he gave me that experience, he said, "Go tell our parents not to be sad anymore. Tell them I'm okay and I want them to be happy when they talk about me." My parents, when my brother died, grieved very differently. My mother wanted to be at the cemetery. She wanted to go all the time because that's where she felt close to her son. My dad absolutely loathed going to the cemetery. For him, it was a place of darkness and death and separation. And he got to the point, I didn't know any of this until 25 years after the fact, but he got to the point where he dreaded coming home from work because he knew when he got home, Mom would want to go to the cemetery, and to be a supportive husband, he'd have to go with her. And they actually separated for a time. They separated for about a year. And if they'd have just had anybody experienced in grief to sit down and talk with them and say, what you're experiencing is normal, and turn to the other one and say, and what you're experiencing is normal. It doesn't mean that either of you love your son more or less because you grieve differently. And if they just had known that, it would have been so much easier for them, I think. And so one of the things that I try to help people understand is that it's okay to grieve the way you grieve, and you don't have to meet anybody else's expectation or description of what grief is. And just give that respect and that gift to the people around you that are grieving differently from you.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us, my darling. It's been a pleasure to see you, especially as I missed you at this conference because of my 50th birthday. I did smile when you said, "What do you mean you're not here?" Because I was looking forward to seeing you. But it's great to see you here on the podcast, and I just know that at some point our paths will cross in a way again. But thank you so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure.
It's wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Amazing.